October 14, 1943. The sky over Schweinfurt burned like a judgment. Hundreds of American bombers roared through the cold air, their bellies filled with explosives, their wings cutting through clouds of black shrapnel. From the ground, Germans watched as the heavens erupted, a sky so full of smoke and fire that it seemed God himself had turned away. For those below, it was not strategy or precision. It was apocalypse. In that moment, the defeated saw the face of modern war, invisible, mechanical, indifferent. The hum of engines replaced the cry of men. The war no longer belonged to soldiers in trenches, but to machines above them and surgeons behind them. And somewhere, far from the burning cities, one American doctor stared into the wounds of his own comrades and made a decision that would change the meaning of protection forever. Colonel Malcolm Grow was not a warrior. He was a healer surrounded by dying men. In a field tent across the channel, he held open the chests of airmen torn by flak fragments, men whose only crime was sitting too long inside flying coffins. He saw patterns in their suffering, not fate, not chance, but mathematics. He realized that death was predictable, measurable, and perhaps preventable. That revelation was not born of glory. It came from exhaustion, from despair, from watching too many young men vanish under his hands. While the victors planned their next missions, the defeated dug graves. Both sides were bound by the same truth. Survival was no longer courage, it was calculation. Grow's invention, armor for the living, would save thousands of Allied airmen, but for those beneath the bombs, protection was a word that no longer existed. And yet, the story of how one man tried to shield life amid the machinery of death is not a tale of victory. It is a story of contradiction, of irony, of humanity trying to outthink its own destruction, because in that age of fire, even mercy could become a weapon, and what began as an act of compassion would leave the world forever changed. October 1942. In the bitter wind over Europe, the war had begun to eat its own children. Bombers rose every morning from English airfields, heavy with fuel, bombs, and young men who tried not to think too much. On the other side of the channel, German cities trembled with sirens that had become as common as church bells. Somewhere between the sky and the soil, the concept of honor dissolved into smoke. To the people below, war no longer looked like soldiers. It was faceless, mechanical, detached. The shadows that crossed the clouds were not men, but engines of destiny, guided by maps and mathematics. Every explosion above meant ashes below. Mothers learned to identify aircraft types by the sound of their engines. Children could tell American from British bombers by the rhythm of the roar. In the cellars of Cologne, Dresden, and Hamburg, people prayed not for victory anymore, but simply for a pause. A single night without fire. But far away in a cold tent in England, a different kind of battle was being fought. Colonel Malcolm Grow, an American military surgeon, had seen too many young airmen arrive broken and silent, their chests torn open by fragments of flak. He did not see heroes or martyrs, he saw patterns, the same wounds, the same pain, the same futility. He noticed something others had ignored. Most of the dead could have lived. Their killers were not bullets or precision strikes, but fragments, pieces of their own aircraft turned against them. It was as if the sky itself was devouring them. This realization haunted him. Each night, as he washed blood from his hands, he thought not about the next mission, but about the one thing no one else seemed to ask. Why did so many die the same way? Could the pattern be broken? Could death, even in war, be reasoned with? Meanwhile, across the ruins of Europe, the defeated lived in a permanent state of waiting. Waiting for the next siren, the next letter that would never come, the next order that might save them or doom them. To them, protection was a fantasy. They could only hide. For every innovation that promised safety to those in the sky, the ground promised only more destruction. A cruel symmetry had emerged. For every airman saved by armor, a family below was buried under rubble. Still, Grow was driven by something deeper than patriotism. He was a man drowning in repetition, the repetition of wounds, of screams, of young faces fading into pale stillness. He began to see war not as chaos, but as a machine, and machines could be redesigned. But could you build compassion out of steel? Could you turn a sword into a shield when the world demanded sharper blades? He studied the wounds like clues in a murder he was determined to solve. The chest, the abdomen, always the same. The fragments moved slower than bullets. Slower meant stoppable. The idea seemed almost heretical. Armor belonged to knights and history books, not to men trapped inside aluminum coffins. But what if history still had answers? What if the past had already solved a problem the present refused to see? While generals debated strategy, Grow scribbled sketches by candlelight, overlapping plates thin and flexible, something a man could wear without becoming a prisoner inside his own uniform. He was not an inventor, not a weapons designer. He was a doctor, desperate to save. Lives in a system built to destroy them. And in that desperation, the first idea of the modern flak vest was born. News of his strange proposal spread through whispers and laughter. Soldiers joked about wearing armor like medieval knights. Officers dismissed it as fantasy. But Grow persisted. He sent reports, numbers, and evidence. He argued that survival could be engineered, that compassion could be calculated. It was a new kind of courage, one that required persistence, not bravado. While he fought for his idea, German civilians fought for their lives. The raids grew heavier. The winter nights became illuminated by falling fire. Firestorms created winds that sucked the oxygen from cellars and shelters. In Hamburg, the asphalt melted and burned the souls of fleeing families. There were no helmets or vests that could protect them. For them, protection was luck. Survival was coincidence. Every bomb that failed to explode was considered a miracle. Somewhere, perhaps, a German doctor in a basement hospital made the same quiet observation. Most of these deaths could have been avoided if the world had chosen differently. The losers did not lack intelligence or compassion. They lacked time and mercy. They saw technology saving their enemies, while their own cities turned into shadows of themselves. They watched as history advanced without them, leaving behind only the smell of dust and defeat. Grow's battle was not just against bureaucracy. It was against indifference, against the belief that death was simply the cost of progress. His idea of armor was not born from patriotism, but from a silent rebellion against fate. And fate, in those years, had grown arrogant. By late 1942, he convinced the higher command to let him test his design. The challenge was not only technical, but philosophical. To build armor for men meant admitting that they were vulnerable. It meant acknowledging fear in an age that glorified courage. Many commanders resisted because protection implied weakness, but Grow knew the truth. Fear was not the enemy. Fear kept men alive. As the first prototypes took shape, somewhere above Berlin, searchlights pierced the clouds, and thousands of eyes watched for the next raid. The sky had become a god that could not be prayed to, only endured. And on both sides of that sky, men waited for the same impossible thing, to survive without losing what made them human. Reports from the front reached Grow's tent daily. Bodies burned, crews missing, missions gone silent. The arithmetic of survival was merciless. Every morning he stood before the wounded, feeling the quiet rage of a man who had seen too much logic in death. He knew his armor would not save everyone, but even one life saved, one chest left unbroken, felt like a rebellion against the absurdity of it all. The first airmen to wear the prototype armor did not trust it. They joked, they complained about the weight. Some refused it entirely. Others wore it like a talisman. But when the first mission returned, and one man stepped out alive with shrapnel lodged in the steel plate instead of his ribs, everything changed. Grow held that vest in his hands and felt something profound, not victory, not pride, but relief. Proof that reason could still save, that compassion still had a place in war. But somewhere in the ruins of Essen, a child touched the jagged edge of an unexploded shell and wondered why his father never came home. The same steel that protected one life had ended another. In the great equation of war, even mercy had consequences. The mathematics of protection had begun to favor one side. Grow did not know it yet, but his invention would outlive him, outlive the war, outlive the men it was built to protect. Yet the paradox remained. For every layer of armor humanity built, it found new ways to destroy itself. The defeated knew this truth intimately. They had worn no armor, but their endurance. And as the cold rain fell on the airfields of England and the ashes of Europe, the question hung in the air like the smoke from burned cities: could technology save humanity, or only teach it to survive its own cruelty? The answer, perhaps, was still waiting in the sky. Winter 1942 arrived with a strange silence over England. The airfields were heavy with fog. the kind that muffled sound and slowed thought. Men moved like ghosts between bombers, their faces pale from lack of sleep and the cold weight of repetition. Each mission felt like a coin tossed into the wind, chance deciding who would return. Meanwhile, across the ruins of Europe, people listened for the sirens that separated life from oblivion. No one believed in glory anymore. The West's only measure left was endurance. Colonel Malcolm Grow still lived in his tent hospital, surrounded by the smell of antiseptic and burnt fabric. Each new arrival carried the same look, not pain, but disbelief. The flak fragments had become familiar killers. Men would clutch at their chests in confusion, their uniforms clean until the blood appeared seconds later. Grow studied these wounds as others might study stars. He mapped them, measured them, turned agony into data. That cold arithmetic, he found both purpose and torment. He knew that beneath every success report and mission statistic were bodies, and behind each body, someone waiting for a letter that would never come. In Germany, the defeated lived in constant twilight. Windows were painted black, not to sleep better, but to avoid becoming targets. The air itself felt suspicious. Children were told to stay quiet, to listen for the rising hum that signaled another night of fire. And when the all-clear finally came, they stepped into a world of ash that no longer remembered color. They began to understand what adults could not say out loud, that survival had nothing to do with right or wrong. It was simply luck. Grow knew luck too. It haunted every corridor of his hospital. Some men arrived laughing despite their wounds, their nerves numbed by shock. Others came silent, already fading. He started to recognize the 1,000-yard stare before it appeared, that distant, detached gaze of someone who had seen too much sky. The war was no longer fought on fronts. It had moved inside people's heads. He worked tirelessly, testing new designs for armor, arguing with officers who measured value only in bombs dropped and missions flown. They saw his work as an inconvenience, a distraction from offense. But Grow was fighting a different kind of battle, against despair itself. He believed that saving even one man was an act of defiance against the void. One cold evening, a test flight returned from France. A navigator stumbled into the medical tent, still clutching his vest. Inside, embedded in the steel plate, was a jagged fragment of flak. It had stopped less than an inch from his heart. Grow held it in his hands, and for the first time in months, he smiled. Proof. Not theory, not hope. Proof that compassion, when engineered correctly, could interrupt death. But far away in the ruins of Essen, a German mother found a different kind of fragment lodged in her wall, a piece of the same metal that had failed to kill one man but had destroyed her home. History was cruelly balanced. For every life protected, another was shattered. Progress never chose sides, and yet, even within the darkness, something strange was happening. Grow's idea began to spread. Other surgeons, engineers, and soldiers started to believe that survival could be designed. Armor was no longer seen as cowardice. It became a form of resistance. In a world that celebrated destruction, protecting life felt revolutionary. Think about that for a moment. How something as simple as protection can become an act of rebellion. Even now in our daily lives, we live surrounded by invisible flak. The fragments are smaller. Fear, failure, rejection, loss. But they strike with the same precision. We all wear some kind of armor. A brave face at work, a forced laugh among friends, the silence before sleep. We learn to protect what is most fragile in us, not with steel, but with habit, with denial, with endurance. And sometimes, just like those airmen, we forget that protection does not mean weakness. It means the will to live again tomorrow. The same question Grow asked in 1942 still matters now. How much suffering can we prevent simply by choosing to care? How many tragedies could be avoided if we valued preservation as much as ambition? War magnified what we often ignore in peace, that humanity's greatest victories are not about conquering others, but about refusing to let despair win. Each of us, in our own way, becomes both the surgeon and the wounded. We build defenses to survive the chaos, to keep the world's shrapnel from piercing too deep. But like Grow, we also have the power to redesign the machinery around us, to make it safer, kinder, more conscious. The story of the flak vest is not only about the airmen who survived, it is about every person who ever looked at a cruel system and said, "This can be better." There is a quiet strength in that decision, a strength that grows not from confidence, but from compassion. Gro's armor was built from mathematics, but it was powered by empathy. He refused to accept that death was the only outcome of war, just as we must refuse to accept that indifference is the price of peace. If you're still here, listening, maybe you understand something deeper about this story. It isn't about the past at all. It's about now, about the armor you build every day without realizing it, about the moments you choose to protect someone else, even when it costs you, about the small rebellions that keep humanity alive in a world that often forgets its own heart. So before we continue this story, take a breath. Let this sink in. One man changed the mathematics of survival by believing that protection was sacred. Imagine what could happen if more of us did the same. Because sometimes the smallest act of care changes more lives than the greatest act of war. If this idea moves you, if you believe that stories like this matter, that compassion is still worth defending, then don't let this moment fade. Click the red button somewhere on your screen and subscribe. Stay with us as we uncover how one surgeon's quiet rebellion against death reshaped the course of history. Because the next part of this story will change how you see not only war, but the human heart itself. The year was 1943, and Europe had become a vast laboratory of survival. Every city, every street, every life was part of an experiment in endurance. The victors fought to dominate the sky, and the defeated tried only to stay alive beneath it. Bombers crossed the continent daily, their engines trembling with the weight of both hope and guilt. Below them, the people who had once believed in empire and destiny now measured time by explosions. Every sunrise was an uncertain gift. Every night was a negotiation with fate. Colonel Malcolm Gro was no longer just a surgeon. He had become something else, a designer of destiny. His idea had escaped the boundaries of medicine. The British had listened reluctantly at first, then with growing urgency. They introduced him to the Wilkinson Sword Company, a place where men once forged weapons of conquest. Now those same forges burned to create protection. Steel that had once divided empires was now meant to preserve lives. There was something deeply ironic in that, and deeply human. Inside the factory, sparks flew like fragments of light against the darkness of war. The craftsmen, old men with steady hands, returned to forgotten traditions. They hammered, shaped, and tested small plates of manganese steel. Each one was a promise, thin enough to wear, strong enough to stop a fragment of death. Gro watched as centuries of violence were transformed into an instrument of compassion. It was a sight that reminded him that even war, in all its madness, could not extinguish humanity's instinct to protect. But can mercy truly coexist with war? Can compassion survive in a world built on destruction? The prototype armor was crude at first, too heavy, too stiff, too hot. Airmen complained it restricted movement, that it made them slower in emergencies. But when the first damaged vest returned from combat, with a jagged piece of flak embedded in its plates, the complaints stopped. It was undeniable proof. A single inch of steel had stood between a man and oblivion. And yet, while the airmen celebrated, the defeated stared into their own reflection in the same metal, wondering what kind of world-measured progress in how efficiently it saved one life while destroying another. Gro was not blind to this paradox. He understood that every act of protection carried its own shadow. The armor saved lives, yes, but it also allowed the war to continue longer, to reach deeper into the cities below. Each technological miracle brought a few more missions, a few more raids. He wondered late at night whether his work prolonged suffering as much as it prevented it. Yet, he could not stop, because every face he saved reminded him that his duty was not to end war. It was to defend the living against it. The Wilkinson engineers worked with an intensity that bordered on devotion. They tested every variation of metal and fabric, looking for the perfect balance between flexibility and strength. It was a delicate equation like life itself. How much weight could one carry before it became unbearable? They consulted medieval manuscripts, studying how knights once solved the same problem with leather, mail, and steel. History, it seemed, was not a straight line but a circle, returning to old wisdom when new horrors demanded it. Imagine that, in the heart of modern war, the future depended on the knowledge of men who had lived 500 years before. The same principles that protected knights in forgotten battles were reborn in the bellies of B-17 bombers. It was as if time itself had decided that survival was the only idea worth repeating. And yet, across the Channel, Germany was enduring the consequences of this innovation. Flak fragments still fell from the sky, but now they found fewer victims in the air. The bombers stayed longer over their targets, more confident, more ruthless. Cities burned longer. The people below learned new ways to bury their dead, faster and quieter. Protection, it seemed, was not equally distributed in war. Still, Grove's work continued. The Wilkinson armor evolved through endless adjustments, each iteration lighter, more practical, more human. It soon became a symbol not just of survival, but of progress, a sign that the future belonged to those who could protect life as fiercely as they pursued victory. In a way, it was the first time technology had dared to take the side of mercy. But how much mercy can a machine hold before it breaks under the weight of its purpose? In the Wilkinson factory, one worker, a man named Thomas Blake, wrote to his wife that he had never felt so proud or so conflicted. Each day, he forged the same kind of steel that had once taken his brother's life in France in 1918. He said it felt like redemption. But he also confessed that every time he shaped a new plate, he imagined it falling through the sky, landing on a city he might once have called beautiful. He ended his letter with a line that captured the spirit of an entire generation. "We have learned to protect men, but not to protect meaning." The British government soon realized the importance of Grove's design. They accelerated production, but Wilkinson's sword could not keep up. There were too many bombers, too many crews. Demand outstripped capacity. The Americans began to prepare their own production lines. Factories that once made tools and typewriters were now making armor for airmen. Even the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York joined the effort, studying medieval armor for inspiration. It was one of the strangest alliances in history. Artists, soldiers, and swordsmiths working together against death. Think about that for a moment. A museum, dedicated to preserving beauty, became a weapon in the fight for survival. History itself was repurposed for war. Can you imagine the silence of those museum halls, once filled with schoolchildren and tourists, now echoing with the hammering of armor plates? The ghosts of ancient knights must have stirred in their displays, watching their designs reborn in an age they could never have imagined. Grove saw this transformation and felt both awe and dread. He was proud of what had been accomplished, but he could not escape the feeling that something larger was shifting, that humanity, in trying to protect itself, was learning how to fight forever. Each new innovation reduced fear, but also reduced hesitation. The safer they became, the further they pushed the boundaries of destruction. What happens when protection becomes permission? By mid-1943, the flak vest was no longer an experiment. It was becoming standard issue. Crews began to fly with a new kind of confidence. Some said it gave them courage. Others said it made them reckless. Grove observed both reactions with quiet concern. He had given them armor, but not peace. He began to understand that survival and humanity were not the same thing. At night, when the air raids thundered over Europe, both sides shared the same question. How much of ourselves can we lose and still call it survival? The armor protected flesh, but not conscience. And while the sky became safer for some, the ground became more dangerous for all. The flak vest was a triumph, yes, but it was also a mirror. It reflected the strange truth of war, that every attempt to save life in one place seemed to demand its sacrifice somewhere else. It forced men like Grove to confront the contradiction at the heart of their mission, that even compassion, when forged in the fires of war, can leave scars that never fade. As the final test results arrived and the production orders multiplied, Grove sat alone at his desk, staring at the fragments of a vest that had stopped a piece of flak mid-air. The steel was twisted, scarred, but intact. He turned it in his hands and whispered to himself, not as a soldier, but as a man, "How long can we keep protecting life while making it so easy to destroy?" By 1943, the war had entered a new and terrifying rhythm. The sky was no longer a battlefield. It was an equation. Every mission, every bomb, every loss was calculated, measured, recorded. Men became statistics, and death became predictable. Europe, from the North Sea to the Balkans, had turned into a theater of smoke and fire, where survival depended less on courage and more on probability. The 8th Air Force grew stronger every month. American bombers flew deeper into Germany, further into the heart of cities that had already forgotten what silence sounded like. And for every new mission launched, the ground below paid a heavier price. Colonel Malcolm Grow watched the transformation unfold from the other side of the channel. His flak vests were no longer prototypes. They were now standard equipment issued to bomber crews. Wilkinson Sword continued to manufacture them, but production had spread to American factories. The design had evolved, lighter, more flexible, more reliable. Each vest represented not just protection, but also proof that technology could save lives even in the most unforgiving conditions. Yet Grow could not escape the irony. His armor was saving men in the air, but those same men were raining destruction upon the people below. At night, German civilians gathered in shelters built beneath their homes. They carried gas masks, blankets, photographs, and a quiet sense of resignation. They learned to recognize the different engines of bombers, the deep hum of a B-17, the sharper growl of a Lancaster. In Hamburg, Dresden, Berlin, Essen, Cologne, Munich, each city became a target in a campaign that would leave entire generations scarred. By the end of the war, 131 German cities would be bombed. Nearly 600,000 civilians would die. 3 million homes would vanish. For many, survival meant little more than waiting for the next siren, the next flash, the next hour in the dark. And yet, amid the ruins, small acts of life persisted. Mothers taught their children how to sleep through explosions. Musicians tried to play in basements. Teachers continued lessons by candlelight. The human spirit refused to disappear, even when the world above was dissolving into ash. In 1943, the flak vest reached the front lines in large numbers. Reports from bomber crews were astonishing. Fatal injuries dropped by more than half. Chest wounds, once the primary cause of death, fell by nearly 80%. Grow's design had done what few believed possible. It had changed the mathematics of survival. For the first time, the odds were no longer entirely against them, but the same statistics that offered hope to one side deepened despair for the other. In the ruins of Kassel or Bremen, survivors whispered of American bombers that seemed untouchable, armored like the future itself. At the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, curators and craftsmen continued their strange contribution to the war. They studied medieval brigandine armor, experimenting with new materials and designs. History had become a blueprint for survival. They combined steel plates with new fabrics like nylon, which offered resistance to heat and water. Every improvement made the armor lighter, stronger, and easier to produce. What had begun as an experiment in a field tent had now become a collaboration between art, science, and necessity. Even beauty, it seemed, had joined the war effort. But the question remained, could progress born from destruction ever be pure? Could an invention created to protect also become a symbol of domination? By October 1943, the war reached one of its darkest days. The mission over Schweinfurt, later known as Black Thursday, became a turning point. Nearly 300 American bombers flew into Germany that morning. 60 were destroyed, 17 damaged beyond repair, and more than 600 airmen were killed or captured. The mission was a disaster. The skies burned for hours as German fighters and flak tore through the formations. But amid the wreckage, medical teams found something remarkable. Dozens of crewmen who survived only because of their armor. Grow's invention had held. The fragments that should have killed them had stopped inches from their hearts. In the hospitals that night, doctors examined the damaged vests with disbelief. The plates were bent, scorched, pierced, but intact, and inside them men were still alive. It was proof that even in chaos, reason could still prevail. But it also proved something darker. The better protected the crews became, the more relentless the bombing could be. The war machine had found a way to harden itself against its own humanity. The raids intensified. In early 1944, the Allied forces began their massive campaign against German infrastructure. Factories and transportation lines. Railroads disappeared. Entire industrial districts were reduced to rubble. The British bombed by night, the Americans by day. In Hamburg alone, 40,000 civilians died in 1 week during Operation Gomorrah. In Dresden, a city of art and culture, firestorms killed more than 25,000 people in 2 nights. The heat melted glass, stone, and steel. The streets turned to rivers of flame. Pilots described seeing the glow from hundreds of kilometers away. From the sky, the bombers looked untouchable. From the ground, they looked like gods without mercy. Grow continued his work with an expression of quiet determination. He improved the armor for different crew positions: pilots, gunners, navigators. He designed special helmets with overlapping steel strips to protect from shrapnel. Every new design saved more lives. By the spring of 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces had issued over 300,000 vests. Casualty reports showed a dramatic decline in fatal torso wounds. The data was undeniable. The armor worked. But something else was happening, something Grow could not have predicted. The psychological effect of survival changed the way men fought. Airmen who once flew with fear now flew with confidence, sometimes too much. The armor gave them courage, but it also gave them distance from the horror below. Protection, in its own way, created detachment. When a man no longer fears death, he stops fearing what he inflicts. Can safety itself become dangerous? On the other side of Europe, the defeated were living through numbers of their own. By 1944, every German city of more than 100,000 residents had been attacked. 6 million people were homeless. Entire neighborhoods vanished. Factories became graves. The survivors dug through rubble not for victory, but for shoes, water, and photographs. They lived in worlds where hope was measured in hours. Even after all the speeches, all the propaganda, they had stopped believing in any future at all. Yet in the small cracks of that hopelessness, humanity still existed. Nurses pulled the wounded from the debris. Priests blessed the dead by the light of burning homes. Strangers shared bread, cigarettes, and silence. It was a different kind of courage, one without banners or medals, the courage of those who stayed when everything else left. By June 1944, the tide of war had shifted. The Allies invaded Normandy. The bombers that once targeted cities now struck at German supply lines and defenses. Grow's armor, once a desperate experiment, had become a standard of modern warfare. The U.S. Army called it the M1 flak vest. By the war's end, nearly 500,000 would be produced. It was an achievement of engineering, medicine, and persistence, and yet, in the burned-out streets of Europe, few saw it that way. To the defeated, each innovation seemed only to perfect the art of survival, for some while erasing it for others. When the war finally ended in 1945, the world tried to count what was left. More than 75 million people were dead. 25 million of them were civilians. Entire nations were unrecognizable. And among the ashes stood the strange legacy of men like Malcolm Grow, men who had tried to make war slightly less fatal. The irony was impossible to ignore. Humanity had created a weapon against death itself, but not against the reasons it kept killing. In the following years, Grow continued to innovate. He developed oxygen systems, heated suits, and psychological recovery programs for soldiers. His vision expanded beyond the body to the mind. He understood that the wounds of war were not only physical, they lived in memory, in silence, in guilt. He worked to create rest centers for airmen who could not sleep, who woke at night hearing engines that no longer flew. He had protected their hearts from shrapnel. Now he tried to protect their minds from what they had seen. The lessons of his armor did not end with him. When the Korean War began, a new version of the vest appeared, lighter, made with ballistic nylon instead of steel. In Vietnam, it evolved again, now able to stop bullets as well as fragments. Modern body armor, used by soldiers and police officers today, still carries his design in its DNA. His innovation changed not only how people fought, but how they lived afterward. The idea that a life could be saved by a few millimeters of material had become part of humanity's conscience. But still the question remains, does protection make us safer, or only make us forget how fragile we are? History records winners and losers, but pain does not recognize sides. In the burned-out streets of Dresden, an old man once said, "They have armor for their bodies, but who will build armor for the soul?" No one answered him. Maybe no one could. Because the truth of war, the one Malcolm Grow understood too late, is that no invention can protect the human heart from itself. The flak vest saved thousands of lives, yes, but it also became a symbol of something deeper, the eternal struggle between our will to destroy and our need to preserve. It showed that even in the darkest hours, humanity can still create light. But it also warned that light, if left unchecked, can blind us. As the years passed and nations rebuilt, Grow's armor found its way into museums, displayed beside the weapons it once resisted. Visitors walked by reading plaques admiring the ingenuity. Few stopped to think about what it really meant, that even our greatest compassion is born from the machinery of violence. And so the story continues. The story of how one man's fight to save lives revealed both the beauty and the tragedy of being human. A story that reminds us that every fragment of metal, every scar, every innovation carries a question we still have not answered. How much of our humanity can we protect before we lose it completely? The war ended in 1945, but its silence lasted far longer. Europe was a continent of ghosts, cities without names, families without graves, memories without rest. From the rubble, a new world began to rise, but beneath its foundations lay the same unanswered questions. What had all this destruction achieved? What was truly protected? And how much of humanity had been lost in the attempt to save it? Colonel Malcolm Grow lived to see the peace he had prayed for, but it was not the kind of peace anyone had imagined. The soldiers came home, the medals were pinned, and the parades marched through streets rebuilt from ashes. Yet even as victory was celebrated, the world felt hollow. Survivors spoke less of glory and more of absence, the absence of sound where laughter used to be, the absence of faces that would never return, the absence of belief in the idea that any side truly wins a war. Grow's invention endured. The flak vest became the foundation for modern body armor. Police officers, soldiers, and journalists now walk protected because of his work. It is easy to see his legacy as one of progress, a triumph of reason over chaos, but there was something deeper in his creation, a silent confession that war had grown too efficient, too detached, too industrial. His armor was born not from the pride of victory, but from the exhaustion of compassion. He built protection because no one else seemed to care enough to. In the decades that followed, nations rebuilt, borders shifted, and economies flourished. But the psychology of fear never disappeared. The defeated lived with it in their bones. Not only the Germans, but the Italians, the Japanese, the millions of civilians who had watched their world collapse and had to learn how to live again. They learned to smile, to rebuild, to forget. But deep inside they carried a knowledge that peace was fragile, conditional, and always temporary. For them, survival came with guilt. The bombers had stopped, but the memories never did. Children who once hid in basements became adults who flinched at thunder. Women who lost everything learned to rebuild walls stronger than concrete, walls inside their hearts. They had no armor like Grow's, only endurance. Their wounds were invisible, but just as deep. It is one thing to survive a war. It is another to live with its echo. History often celebrates the victors, but the truth of World War II belongs to everyone. To the airman who lived because of a steel vest, and to the child buried beneath the same metal. The numbers remain impossible to grasp. 75 million dead, countless more wounded in ways statistics cannot measure. Each number hides a story, a last letter, a broken photograph, a promise unfulfilled. In that sense, there were no winners, only survivors. Grow became the first surgeon, General of the United States Air Force, a position that allowed him to influence how future wars were fought, or perhaps how they could be endured. He pushed for better medical care, for psychological recovery programs, for the understanding that a soldier's mind could bleed just as easily as his body. But even as he worked, new wars began elsewhere. Korea, Vietnam, the same sky, the same machines, the same logic. Humanity kept finding new reasons to test its endurance. And yet even in that endless repetition, there was hope. Because every generation that looked back at World War II saw not just destruction, but reflection. The defeated nations rebuilt not as empires, but as societies dedicated to peace. Germany turned its memory into a monument of responsibility. Japan transformed its shame into innovation. Italy sought beauty again in the ruins of pride. The world learned, at least for a while, that progress must serve life, not consume. Still one can ask, have we truly learned? Or have we only become better at surviving the lessons we refuse to face? Today, Grow's armor exists in every conflict, every uniform, every city where danger lurks unseen. We trust it to protect our bodies, but rarely do we ask what protects our conscience. We build walls, technologies, and systems to keep ourselves safe, yet the same fear that once burned over Europe still lingers inside us. Fear of loss, fear of difference, fear of memory. Perhaps the real armor humanity needs is not made of steel or fabric, but of empathy, the ability to see our reflection even in the eyes of those we once called enemies. Because when history repeats itself, it does not do so out of fate, but out of forgetfulness. The defeated of World War II knew something the victors often forgot. That pain is the most honest teacher, and memory the only true protection. Their stories remind us that strength without compassion becomes cruelty, and progress without reflection becomes peril. They remind us that even the smallest act of kindness in a time of chaos can change the course of history. Think about that. How one doctor's refusal to accept unnecessary death reshaped the very nature of war. If one man, surrounded by blood and despair, could build something to protect life, what could we build today if we had the same courage to care? What kind of world could we create if protection became a universal mission, not a privilege? We still live under the shadow of that war in ways we barely notice. Every act of diplomacy, every peacekeeping mission, every humanitarian law owes something to those who suffered. They forced the world to remember what happens when humanity forgets itself. The ruins of Berlin, Warsaw, and Hiroshima are not just memorials of destruction, they are warnings written in stone. And yet, there is still beauty in the story of the defeated. Because in their rebuilding, in their quiet forgiveness, in their capacity to endure, they gave meaning to survival. They proved that humanity can rise again, not through conquest, but through conscience. That the true victory of World War II did not belong to the nations that won, but to the people who refused to stop believing in life. If you have stayed with this story until now, it means something inside you still listens, still wonders what kind of world we are building today. Let this not be just a history lesson, but a reminder, a mirror, a question. What are we protecting now, and at what cost? If this story moved you, if you believe that remembering matters, that empathy is still worth defending, then do not let this be the end. Click the red button to subscribe, like this video to help it reach others who need to hear it, and share your thoughts or memories in the comments below. You can write anonymously if you wish. Your words might help someone else understand that even in the darkest times, humanity can still find its way back to the light. Because stories like this do not end when they are told, they live on when they are shared.